Hi, welcome to this Vue 101 training presented by this.labs. In this training, we will be teaching you Vue 3, assuming that you have no prior knowledge in Vue.js. You will learn concepts such as component creation, as well as directives and state management. Through hands-on exercises and practical examples, you'll gain a solid understanding of Vue's reactive nature, as well as how to build robust applications. By the end of this training, you'll have the confidence to start creating your own Vue applications from scratch. My name is Allan Jeremy, and I am a senior software engineer at this.labs. I'm a full-stack developer, primarily working with Vue.js on the front end. And in my previous project, I had an opportunity to build something that would be used by 10 to 100 million people that was powered by Vue.js on the front end. So, without further ado, this is what the schedule for this particular training is going to be like. We're going to have 6 modules. The first module will be an introduction to Vue and its ecosystem. The second module is going to be component definition and data flow. The third module is going to be the composition API, which is a new way of writing Vue applications that was introduced in Vue 3. In the fourth module, we'll talk about the Vue Router, which is going to allow us to navigate between different pages and routes. And in the fifth module, we'll talk about global state management using something called Pinia, which is the recommended approach by the Vue.js team. Lastly, in the sixth module, we'll talk about testing, the different types of tests that are available, as well as the tools that we can use to test, and we'll also be writing our own tests. So here's what we'll learn. We'll understand Vue and its history. We'll learn the basic features of Vue. We'll learn routing in Vue, state management, unit tests, and we'll also give you a lot of resources that you can use to learn even more about Vue. At the end of the day, you'll end up leaving with a sample application that you can take home, unless you're working remotely, in which case you're already home. Anyway, first we will get into the introduction to Vue.js and its ecosystem. So Vue is a JavaScript framework for building front-end user interfaces. Vue.js is focused on the view layer of an application, and it is a simple and flexible tool that we can use to build both small-scale and large-scale projects. It quickly gained popularity among developers due to its simplicity and flexibility. It's also really cool to know that it is the most stud GitHub front-end JavaScript framework, and Vue.js is followed in second place by React. It is also really good because it is incrementally adoptable, which means that you don't need to convert your entire application to Vue.js. You can simply start building small pieces of your application in Vue and then adopt Vue incrementally as your application grows. So before we get into the actual training, we need to talk about some prerequisites. What do you need to know in order to follow along with this training? So first, you'll need some knowledge of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. You will also need to have the latest Node.js installed on your computer, an IDE that you can use to follow along and build your Vue.js applications. In this particular case, we'll be using VS Code. You'll need some basic knowledge of Git because the repository or this particular trainings project is stored on GitHub, and you will need to clone it in order to follow along. You'll additionally, with regard to the IDE, need to install certain extensions, and we'll go over that when we get to the demo section. So here are some useful resources that you can use to learn a bit more about Vue. So we have the official Vue documentation. This is a perfect place to reference at any point in your development. We have Vue Meetup Online, which is a monthly Vue meetup held by this.labs every third Thursday of the month. You also have access to the Vue cheat sheet, and a free cheat. This is a free cheat sheet that includes all the essential Vue syntax that you may need, and it has been provided by the creator of Vue Mastery, which is another resource that you can use to learn about Vue. There's a couple more resources that you can see on screen at the moment. And you can install and check these out if you'd like to learn a bit more about Vue or improve your Vue experience. So without further ado, it's demo time, and we will now move to the code. So we currently have this project, which you can get to by running git clone this command. Oops. Yeah. So you can clone the repository and clone the first module branch, which is 101-1. Each and every single module will have its own branch, and you can follow along based on the instructions that will be provided with each and every single module. So in this particular case, we've already cloned the repository. This is what it looks like. If you want to run the application, you'll also need to first install the dependencies with npm install. We've already done that. And you will run the application using npm run dev. Currently, we're getting an error, and we will explain what this error is about shortly. But your application should be visible on the right-hand side. So we've opened a browser window so that you can see the results of what your code is. So why do we have this error? Before we can fix this, we actually need to talk about the structure of Vue applications and the structure of our project. So we'll start with the project, and then we'll move to how Vue applications are structured. So our project is structured as such. We have a public folder. So we have the storybook. You can ignore that for now. We have VS Code, which is VS Code specific stuff. You can also ignore that. Anyway, public is going to be where we store our public assets. In this case, we just have our fave icon. And then we have our source, which is src, which is where majority of our code will reside. Inside our source, we have assets. These are any assets that may need to be pre-processed whenever we are building our Vue application. And then we have components. Inside components, we have various files. And now would be a great time to mention that Vue files usually end with the .vue extension. So we have this default .vue file. This is what we'll be using for our demo. And then we have an exercise1.vue file, which is going to be an exercise that you can follow along with, and you can take time to use that to learn Vue. Also, worth mentioning that when you do npm run dev, you can access your web app through localhost, and then the port is going to be 5173 by default. So back to default Vue. So how is a Vue.js application structured? And that is going to resolve this error. So a Vue.js application can have three different parts. The first part is going to be a template section. And this is where our HTML would go. So if you wanted to say hello world, we could say that here. And then we can stop our application, run npm run dev once again. And we can now see hello world. If we change this to hello this dot training, it will update on the right hand side. So we have hot reloading. So the template section is going to be where our HTML is. We have two other sections. So we have script. Script is going to be where our JavaScript resides. And this is where you can run any JavaScript that you want in your application. We haven't yet talked about components, but this particular file is what you'd call a single file component. So if we say hello from the console here and check the right hand side, we would see hello from the console. So the script section is going to be for our JavaScript. If you wanted to use TypeScript, you would say lang and then say equal ts. So that's the second section when it comes to the structure of Vue applications, or rather Vue files. And the last part is going to be the style section, which is where you can add various styles that apply to your current file or to your application. So in this particular case, let's say we wanted to change this H1 to be red, then we would come to this style section and you could say that the color is red, and that changes it here. So alternatively, you can also restructure this however you please. So you can have the script first, followed by the template. This will not affect the behavior. Now, in Vue 2, in the template section, you could only have one root element, which meant that if you had a div here and you tried to add another div after it, you would get an error. However, in Vue 3, you can have as many elements as you want here. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the component definition module, and we'll talk about the different things that you can do in the script section. We'll talk about the different things that you can do in the template section, as well as how to display dynamic information that comes from your script. And yeah, that's basically it as far as the structure of Vue files is concerned. So once again, Vue files have the extension of .vue, and Vue files have three parts. They can have a script section, which is where our JavaScript would go. They can have a template section, which is where our markup or HTML would go. And they can have a style section, which is where our styling would go. One thing we haven't mentioned about the style section is that currently, when you apply this style, it applies to this file and it can also affect other files. If you only wanted this to affect this current file, then you would add scoped as an attribute. However, let's say you wanted to use something like Sass or SCSS. How would you do that? So you would also add another attribute, which is lang, and you can say SCSS. So that's it. And we will now head to the next module. But before that, we need to talk about the application that we'll be building for this particular training. So what we're going to try and build is going to be an application that displays a list of articles. And at the moment, how we're going to do this is by adding that in this template section. So I'll just delete all that. Say template, and then we are going to add a container. We'll also add a heading and just say we have a list of our articles, and we can add another container where we will now, so remember the template section is going to be the HTML of our application. So for now, we're just adding static content. So we'll just say that we need some type of heading for our article. So article heading, and we need some kind of content for our article, which is going to be, this is going to be the excerpt for our article, so the summary. So let's just say some lorem ipsum text, and this is Emmet. If you're using VS Code, you can just type lorem and then a number, and it will generate some dummy text that you can use. So this is what our article looks like. In the next section, which is going to be the component definition, we'll talk about how we can make this dynamic, and that will involve using our script section, where we will add our JavaScript, and we will also talk about the options API and how you can build your components. So without further ado, that's going to be it for the introduction to Vue, as well as Vue files and how they work. There's a couple of files we did not cover in this, but for now, they do not matter. All we need to care about is going to be this default.vue file. And as time goes by, we'll go over each and every single one of these, most of them. Welcome back to the component definition and data flow module. In this module, we'll be talking about how you can define components in Vue In the previous module, we talked about what kind of application we'll be building, as well as the structure of Vue applications, but we never really went into detail as to how you would build components. Speaking of components, what exactly are components? So a Vue component is a reusable piece of code that you can plug into different pages. And it is basically going to be a snapshot of a piece of a web page. So for example, if you had a login page and you wanted that login form to be in different parts of your application, you could create that as a component. Components are similar to Legos in that you can interconnect them, and there are a couple of benefits as to why you would use components in the first place. So the first benefit is going to be it reduces code duplication. The other benefit is going to be that it allows you to break your application into smaller chunks. And as a result of that, it simplifies large application structures. And because we are splitting different parts of our application into smaller components, we are able to individually upgrade each component. So let's say we wanted to add some special functionality to our login form. We'll be able to do that by modifying the component and having that reflect in every single part of our application that needed our login form. There are different ways to customize applications and components in applications, and we will be talking about those in the demo section. Of which, speaking of the demo section, here's what we're going to be covering. We'll be talking about style, which we have talked about before with the style section of the Vue files. We'll also be talking about data, which is how can you have dynamic data in your templates section. We'll be talking about directives, which is how can you conditionally display things, how can you loop through things in your template, as well as how we can handle events. So without further ado, let's get back into the code. So in our previous example, we'll go back to this module. So in our previous example, we talked about having a list of articles, and how we were going to do this is what it looks like. So how we were going to do this is simply list out articles, and ideally we would want these articles to come from an API. So how do we do this? The first thing we need to do is go to our script section, and we'll talk about how Vue.js applications are structured. We will also run npm run dev to start our server. And then we can just change some text here to see that it has indeed changed and it has indeed been loaded. So here's what we're going to do. In the script section, we need to add an export default, which will export an object. And this is how components are going to be structured. So we have the template section, which is going to be our HTML. But the question is, if we wanted this article to be displayed dynamically, which is, it comes from our JavaScript, how would we do that? So to do that, we need to talk about the structure of this script section. And typically in a Vue component, you would export a default object, and this object accepts a few properties. It accepts a name. The name is going to be the name of your component. By default, this will default to the name of the file, which in this case is default. That's default a lot of times. Anyway, the next thing we need to do is have data, and this is going to be a function that returns an object. And as the name implies, we will be able to insert any dynamic data that we want here. So let's say we had an article. We could add it here as a property, and we can give it a title. And let's say that the title of our article is going to be article heading, which is what we have above. We'll close the console for now. And then we want to say that the content of our article is going to be this lorem ipsum text. So we'll cut that, paste it in here. Probably messed something up. Okay, it's just new lines. So we're gonna add that. Now the question is, we now have nothing in our template section. So how do we display this information here? So how we do this in Vue is through using double curly braces. And that means that anything inside here can be a JavaScript expression. So if we did 2 times 2, we would get 4, because this is going to be evaluated as a JavaScript expression and it will be displayed in our template. In this particular case, what we want is to get this article in the data section. And how we do that is by writing article, and article is the name of the property that we've added in this data object that is returned by the data function. And we have access to any of these things in the data section within our template. So we'll say article and then dot title. And now we see article heading. Then for our content, we do the same thing. So you add the 2 curly braces, which means that you want to display dynamic content from JavaScript here. And we will say article.content. But now the question is, if we wanted to display a list of articles, how would we do that? So in order to do that, we first need to change this to be an array. So we'll say articles, and then we'll simply wrap this with these square brackets. And now that means this is an array. So if you tried to access article now, we will get nothing, and it will tell us cannot read properties of undefined because we no longer have article. So we do have articles. So if we wanted to display the first article, we would say article 0 at the index of 0, and that would still work. However, what we want is to be able to loop through each and every single article. And in this case, let us duplicate this and just add a second article. And we can see that it is not displayed here. Why? Because we are doing articles, and then we're saying we want the first article and we want to get its title. So one way we could do this is by taking this, duplicating it, and then adding 1, 1. But there's multiple problems with this. First, we have code duplication, and that's not good. Secondly, as the number of articles grows, we will have to duplicate this a lot of times, and we do not know ahead of time how many articles we will have. So instead, what we want to do is find a way to loop through each article regardless of how many articles we have. So that introduces the concept of directives in Vue. So a directive is simply going to be an attribute that you can apply to any element or component. And the first directive that we're going to talk about is going to be v_for. So v_for is going to allow us to loop through items. So in this particular case, we are going to loop through articles, and the syntax for v_for is going to be the thing that you want to extract out of what you're looping through. So in this case, we have a list of articles. We want to extract an article, and then we will say in, and then where we are getting it from. So we want to get an article from the list of articles that we have. And now, instead of duplicating this, we will now have access to an article here. So we still get the same thing in our browser, but we're getting an error here. So why is that the case? This is because we need to add another attribute called key, and this is going to introduce another directive. So if we wanted to add a dynamic attribute, we need to use something called vbind. Vbind is a directive that allows us to bind dynamic values, which are values that we get from our data section, to attributes in our template section. So in this case, we want to add a key. So normally we can add a key by just adding the attribute. And right now it's not going to work because we need the key to be unique for each and every single item that will loop through. And the v-for directive, while it does allow us to loop through the articles, it still needs you to specify a key because that's the way Vue will know what has been rendered and what has changed and what hasn't. And whenever something changes, Vue needs to know what to update so it doesn't update everything. So the key needs to be unique. But now let's say we wanted the key to be the title, or we wanted to add an ID field. So let's say ID is going to be 1 for this, and ID is going to be 2. And we assume that the ID is going to be unique. So how do we get this key to have this value of ID? If we just wrote article.id here, that's not going to work. Instead, we need to use a directive called vbind, and we will say v-bind, and then add a colon, and then key. So it's going to be vbind, and then the attribute that you want to bind a dynamic value to. So when we say vbind colon key, that's going to allow us to enter any JavaScript expression here, and that gets rid of the error, because right now we're saying that for each article that we have, we want to get a key, and we want to set a key, and we want the key to be the ID of the article. And since the ID in this case is going to be unique, that gets rid of our error, and now Vue knows that it can update things without missing track of what has been updated and what hasn't been updated. So the problem is, as your application grows, you may not want to keep typing vbind. So Vue has added a shorthand, which we will be using for the rest of this training. And the shorthand is going to be to get rid of the vbind and just leave the colon. So doing this is the equivalent of doing this. So if you get rid of the vbind and just leave the colon, that's the same as doing vbind and then the attribute. So if we wanted to, for example, add dynamic classes, you can say colon class or vbind class, and then you can add whatever expression you want here. So that's the two directives we've talked about so far. One is v-for, which allows us to loop through different elements in a list or in an iteratable thing. So in this case, our articles, and the v-for needs a key. And in discussing why it needs a key, we have talked about vbind, which allows you to bind dynamic values to attributes. So in this case, our key is going to be article ID. But now that we are rendering our articles, let's think about another feature that we could add. So we could add a search feature. And in order for us to add the search feature, we'll need to talk about two different things. So before we do add the feature though, we want to add an input, and we'll have that input here and just say that the type is going to be text or search. And then, one moment. And then we will say that the placeholder is search through articles. And at the moment, this does nothing. So we can search whatever we want, but we won't find it. So what we do want is to be able to keep track of the value that has been entered in this search box. So how we do that is through another directive, once again, that is called vModel. So what vModel accepts, it will accept a variable that you've provided through this data object. So in this particular case, we can just say search text, and we'll say that this is an empty string by default. And then we will say that this vModel is going to be equal to the search text. And right now, you can't tell that anything is happening, but if we were to instead here say we have a paragraph that says our search text is going to be whatever our search text is, then you will see that the value changes dynamically. So what we have is two-way data binding. What happens is that with vModel, the value of such text is updated when you update the value of this input, and when you update the value of such text elsewhere, then the value of the input is updated. So that's called two-way data binding. So in this particular case, whatever we type here now is going to be, so if you type search text or we type hello world, we can see that that is dynamically updating here. So now, what do we want to do? We want to be able to search through our articles, and in order to do so, we first need to be able to filter the articles. We need to add functionality that filters the articles anytime we do search here, so that we only display the articles that actually match our filter. So to do that, we are going to add another data attribute, and we're going to say filtered articles. And this is going to be an empty array by default. And then instead of us displaying, instead of us displaying these articles, what we want to do is display the filtered articles. So in our v4, we will say for article in filtered articles. And right now, this is going to be empty because our filtered articles is an empty array. So if instead, so the question is, how do we display the default articles if we have not yet searched for something? So in order to do that, let's first talk about how we are going to be filtering these things. This is going to introduce a new concept, which is going to be computed. So what we want is actually to derive the filtered articles based on our search results. So right now we've added this to the data section, and as an empty array, that's why we can't see anything. But we want to be able to say that depending on what happens to this search text, depending on what the search text is, show us the different articles that match that search text. And that is going to mean that we have a value that is derived from the search text. And anytime you have a value that is derived from something else, you use computed properties. And in order to use computed properties, we'll add yet another property to our default object that we export as part of our component. And this will accept functions, and these functions will return things that are affected by other things. This will make sense very shortly. So in this case, we want filtered articles, and we'll just create it as an empty function for now. Thank you, Copilot, but we'll ignore you. We'll delete this from the data section. And for now, we'll just say that it returns this dot articles. So if you want to access something in the data section anywhere else within this exported default object, so for example, in a computed property, you would come here and use this and then dot the name of the attribute you want to access. So in this case, we're just saying that we want our filtered articles to be the equivalent of our current articles. And if we save that, then we now see our articles once again. But again, if we search here, we see nothing. So the next thing we need to do is specify the logic that would allow us to bind the search result of this search text to whatever articles are displayed. So in this case, let's just say we will be searching by title and by content. So how we do that in this case, we'd say filter, and then we'll add an arrow function. We'll just say article, and we want to take this article if the title to lowercase so that it is case insensitive, includes the such. We'll just take Copilot's suggestion because that's what we were going to type. So if our current title includes the such text, then we want to return that article. So now if we type, we don't see anything. I wonder what could be wrong. Let's see. So we will refresh this. And if we type now, we don't see anything yet. So we want to say that if our, let's see, if our article.title to lowercase includes this such text to lowercase, let's even get rid of the to lowercase so that we can debug this a little faster. Okay, so such, okay, let's see. Oh, okay, so this is my fault. So we are looping through the articles rather than the filtered articles. So if we wanted to see the results of this, we would actually want to come here. So we'd say filtered articles, because that means we want to loop through the filtered articles. But the problem now is that whatever we have, whenever we don't have anything in our search, all our articles disappear, and we don't want that to happen. So instead, we will say if we don't have anything in our search text, we want to return all the articles. And if we refresh that, that will return all the articles. Now, if we search for something whose title does not necessarily match something that we have here, then all our articles disappear. So what we want to do now is just add one more check. We'll return the to lowercase. And all this to lowercase does is it makes sure that regardless of whether or not our text matches the case of whatever we're searching for, we will be able to find it. And then we also want to search by content, so we will say or article.content to lowercase includes the search text to lowercase. So in this case, if we search for second title, then we should only get this article. So if we search second, wait a minute, article content, I messed up again. So if we search for, let's see, article dot, right, again, another mistake. So mistakes are learnings. What we do have here is this filter expects you to return a boolean, but right now we are not returning anything. So what we want to do is return this, and that should work. So if we search for second article or second, only our second article matches that, so our search works. If we search for, let's change the heading of the first article to first article. If we now search first, only the first article appears. If we search second, only the second article appears. If we search lorem, only the first article appears. So now we have the ability to filter through our articles. The question is, if we don't have results, how do we display to the user, or how do we know that there are no articles? Because it wouldn't make much sense for us to search for foo and then not see any results and not know whether our application is broken or not. So that brings us to another directive. So we will use a template tag, which will not appear in our HTML, but we will use a template tag to wrap this section and say that we are going to use a VF, which is another directive, and it accepts a condition. So whatever is inside this is going to appear if this condition is true. So if we say VF true, then we remove the search. we'll see everything. If you say vif false, then everything disappears. The other thing that we need to know about is another directive called vshow, and I'll explain the difference between vshow and vif. So with vshow, what happens is we need to go to our HTML here in order for us to see what's happening. So we'll open this. We have, okay, so let's just change this to a div so that we can demonstrate this. So with vshow, if we say vshow false, then we'll see that the style for our div is going to be none. And let's change this to a section so we can identify it easily. But the key thing is that the section is in the DOM. But if we say vif false, then the section disappears from the DOM. So whenever the vif is falsy, the thing inside it, all its children, will disappear from the DOM. 1 second for a glass of water. So now, instead of false or true, we want to actually check if we have any filtered articles. So if we do have filtered articles, so we'll say filtered articles dot length is greater than 0, then we want to display them. But if we don't have articles, we want to display something else. So let's say we wanted to, let's add another section and say we wanted to display no articles found. Right now, no articles found is displayed even though we have articles. But since we've already checked that we have articles here in order to render this list of articles, we can add an else statement to this vif, which is another directive, and we can say velse to only have no articles found when we display, when we do not have articles. So if this condition is false, it will fall back to this velse. Additionally, even though we won't be using this, there's a velse if, which simply allows you to chain another condition. But for now, we'll be using velse. So now if we search for something that doesn't exist, we'll see no articles found. And again, remember, vif will completely remove this section from the DOM if this condition is faulty. But if you used vshow, then it would be in the DOM, it would just be hidden. So that's it as far as creating components is concerned and displaying information is concerned. In this particular case, when we're saying no articles found, we'll just say for such text, and then we'll add quotes and simply display what the user searched for. And then we'll get rid of this paragraph that displays such text. So now if we search with foo, we'll just see no articles found for such text foo. Okay, so that's going to be the data section in the script section, which is going to be where we have any information that we want in our application to access, any information that we want to access dynamically in our application. And then we'll have computed, which is going to contain our filtered articles, and computed is simply going to accept functions. Computed properties accept functions that return values that are derived from other values. So in this case, we want anytime the such text changes, our filtered articles computed would be triggered. That's why if we search here, whatever we search changes the search text, which in turn calls this filtered articles, and then it runs this logic and returns whatever matches that logic. One other thing that we should mention about computed properties is that the function must always return something, and it is not recommended for the function to have side effects. So this should not modify any data, but it should simply return a value that is based on other values in your application. Regardless, we still haven't covered something called methods, which is let's say you wanted to maybe reverse this text for whatever reason. We are simply going to use this for example purposes, but if you wanted to reverse it, let's say every article had a button that said reverse article, right? And reverse article text. And we wanted to reverse the text of this article. How would we do that? If you click this button right now, nothing happens. But we can add a method that can be called whenever certain events are triggered. So in this particular case, we want to say that when something is clicked, when this button is clicked, we want to call this method. So how we're going to do that is we will come here and add methods. And this is going to be another property in this default exported object. And we will simply say that we want to reverse the article text, and Copilot has helped us. What we want to say is that we'll take an argument that is an article. This article will then have its content modified to be reversed. And, we want to now use this inside, let's see, want to use this with this button, right? However, whatever Copilot has provided us with will not work quite well. So, and the reason it won't work is because we've passed in an argument that is an article. We're modifying the contents of this article, but we are not actually modifying the article in this data section, which is where our data comes from. So what we want to do is come to this button, and we will yet again use another directive. This is going to be called v_on, and then colon, and then after this colon, you can add any event. So in this particular case, we want to say click. So v_on, when this button is clicked, we want to do this thing, and you can pass a method here. So in this particular case, if we pass this reverse article text like this, we are not able to provide the article. What actually ends up happening is that this will pass you the event as the argument. So instead, what we'll get will be the event that was triggered, but that's not what we want. So in this case, we will say we have an arrow function, and that's how you would bypass the event being passed to you. The event is still passed here if you want to access it for whatever reason. And we want to call this reverse article text with the current article. So if we click on this, oh, it actually worked. That's surprising. Okay, I guess the reason it did work is because we are modifying the value by reference. So if we change this article.content, we've actually changed the article itself. Like we're not having this is not creating in JavaScript, this is not creating a duplicate of the article. We are actually modifying the article. But let's say for whatever reason, you were not able to do this. Instead, what you could do is you could come here and say this, again, dot. Inside your method, this is how you'd access other properties here. And then you'd go to articles and say that you want to, you can map through them, get each article, and for each article, you check if the article ID matched the article that we provided here. So we can just, if we say article provided, for example, then we could say that if the article ID inside our articles array matched whatever article has been provided, then we wanted to modify that article's content to be the reverse. So once again, you can access any property from within your methods or your computed using this dot and then its name. And if you wanted to, for example, access the filtered articles, you can also do the filtered articles here. So we'll just revert this. And now if we click the button, it reverses the text. So the question now would be, do you have to write v on and then this every single time? No, the answer is no. Instead, Vue has a shorthand, and the shorthand is going to be used to use the @ symbol. So if you say @click, it's the same as writing v on click. And now if you say @click, then we can call this arrow function and pass in our article, and this would work the same way. So that's it as far as creating components is concerned, and using this data section to store our information, the computed section to store values that are derived from other values. And then we have methods where we can add any arbitrary functions that we may want to call. So if we had a function that wanted us to, for example, create, let's see, what would you want to do? So if we had a function here that wanted us to reverse the article text, for example, or we had a function that wanted to make API requests, we could have it in this methods section. Also, note how we are adding these different properties to this default object. These are called options. And since these are options that we are passing for our component, this is called the options API. Okay, so that's it. I think there's maybe one or two more things that we could mention that are nice to haves or nice to knows. And one of them is going to be, let's say you had a form and you wanted the submit button to prevent the default behavior of the form, which is to refresh the page. You'd be able to do that with things called event modifiers. And how you do them is you chain them to whatever event you have. So in the case of click, you can say click dot and then prevent, and there's a couple of them. You can find them in the documentation for Vue.js. And what these allow you to do is simply prevent common things that you would normally have to write your logic for in the JavaScript. So for example, for this prevent, it would be the same as receiving an event here and then saying event.prevent default. This is a common thing that you might want to do. So I just wanted to mention that you can have event modifiers in your event handlers. So again, v-on is the directive. The shorthand is going to be this @ and you have access to all kinds of events. By default, you pass in the event to whatever function that you pass here. But in this case, since we want to pass a different argument, we used an arrow function and then called the function inside the arrow function. And that allowed us to do that. And the next thing we'll be talking about is going to be the lifecycle methods. So this is if you want to do things before your component is created or after your component is mounted, how are you going to go about this? That is going to be the main point of our next module. So thanks. See you then. And as we mentioned in an earlier module, you have access to this file, exercise 1. It contains instructions on what you need to do for your first exercise. This will be using the knowledge from what we have already talked about. In this particular case, we will be building a joke application. So you'll be able to display a list of jokes and then show or hide a punchline. And this is going to be the first exercise that allows you to do that. So check out the exercise 1 file and follow the instructions that are here. Based on the knowledge that we've acquired through the modules so far, you'll be able to complete this exercise. And in case you feel stuck, feel free to leave a question and feel free to pause for as long as you want. So, yeah. Next, we move to lifecycle methods. Welcome back, and we will be continuing where we left off with the Vue lifecycle. And this is going to be the process that your Vue components will go through whenever they are created, from when they are created to when they are destroyed. And the current chart that you're seeing on screen is that process. We will have before and after events. So before we have created the component, we'll have before create, and then after we've created it, we'll have created. And then before the component has been added to the DOM, we'll have before mount, and after it's been added to the DOM, we'll have mounted. Then once it has been mounted, before any virtual DOM re-renders occur, we will have access to the before update, and after the virtual DOM re-renders have occurred, we will have access to the updated. So after the component has been destroyed, then we have access to the destroyed lifecycle method. And the next thing we're going to do right now is going to be to get into the demo section, where we'll be talking about loading things asynchronously, as well as lifecycle methods, which you've just seen in the previous slides, and props, which we have not yet covered, but they allow you to pass information into your components. So now we'll move back to the code, and this looks a little different from what we left, but it's the same functionality. So if we search CSS, for example, we will find those articles. The main things that have changed here is we've done a little cleanup and we've changed the styling up a bit to make it look a little nicer. Plus we've changed the articles to be sensible defaults for the articles, but the functionality is the same. So anyway, how do we use lifecycle methods as we've talked about them? When you are using the options API, what you want to do is add additional options for each lifecycle method. So in this particular case, we have before create, and you will simply add it as an option after your other options, or before, wherever you want, but the convention is to add it after. Your other options, such as the computed methods and data, and we will simply console log before create. So if we save this, we'll see that this is being called. And then if we want to know when the created event has been created lifecycle method has been called, then we can just console log created here. And again, you can have whatever business logic you want at each of these stages. But in the before create and created, it is worth noting that you will not have access to anything in the DOM because the component has not yet been added to the DOM. In which case, before it is added to the DOM, you can say before mount, and we'll just console log before mount. Thank you, Copilot. And then after it has been mounted, we can say console log mounted. And now if we look on the right hand side, we will first have our before create called, and then we'll have our created, and then we'll have our before mount, and then we'll have our mounted. And if we wanted to access anything in the DOM, we would do it in mounted, because that's when our component has been added to the DOM. So if you wanted to maybe change the scroll height of something, then you do that in mounted and not anywhere else, because you wouldn't be able to access that. The other one is going to be before update. And the last one that we'll cover for this particular case is going to be console log, which is console log updated. It's going to be updated. So now if we look at this, we have the before create, created, before mount, and mounted. if we want to trigger updated, we need to perform an action that modifies our component. In this particular case, if we were to filter an article, then we would have before update and updated triggered. So because this changes the state of our component, which in turn is considered an update on our component. So if we wanted to observe that, we could observe that through the before update. If you want to know about it before it has been added to the re-rendered version of your component. But if you wanted to access the updated state in the already re-rendered version of your component, then you do that in updated. However, if we wanted to specifically observe for changes in this such text, how would we do that? So currently, this before update and updated, they are triggered whenever anything changes in the component. So if we had a button, as we did before for reversing the text, that would trigger the before update because the DOM would be updating. If we change the such text, then that would be triggered as well. So there is a way in Vue to observe for specific changes within your component, and it's called watch. So this is an option, again, that will be structured as an object, and this object can take either a function or an object. So the function is just going to have the same name as what you want to observe. So if you want to observe for the value filter, which was previously called such text, if you want to observe for the value filter, we would say filter, and then we would say that the filter console log, the filter has changed. So we'll clear our console, and now if we type something here, hello, we'll see that the filter has changed, has been triggered 5 times, which is once for each letter. But the question is, if we wanted to know what the old value was versus the new value, how would we do that? So this, any function that you add within watch, and the reason it's a function is because you want to be able to access the old value versus the new value, potentially. And any function that is added here provides you with the new value and the old value of this particular thing. So filter in this case is the value that is bound to this input. So if we wanted to know what the new value of filter is, we'd get that as the first argument to this watcher for the filter. And we'll say here it has changed from this to this. So it has changed from the old value to the new value. And if we refresh right now and save that, then we can come here and say hello. And we can see that, for example, here we have changed from having an empty string to having a H, from having a H to having a HE, and so on and so forth. So that's how you can use watches. There is an option for using watches as objects, which allows you to customize their behavior even more, but you can find out more about that. You can find out more about that in the Vue documentation. So the next thing we need to talk about, other than watches, is going to be how do you perform asynchronous operations. So when it comes to methods, for example, if you wanted to get articles, right? And if this was, let's say, from an API, let's say you were make an API request here, right? You can use async methods here, and you can await things. So you can await, maybe get articles, assuming we had something like that. And again, you can access all these things. You can access other methods using this dot, or you can access computed properties or data using this dot, no pun intended. So we'd be able to do something like await get articles, for example. Alternatively, we'd also be able to say this dot get articles, and then just chain a then, and then in the then, let's say articles, we can then assign those to whatever articles we got from the API. So let's just say from API, for example. We'll see this manifesting more in future modules. So for now, we just need to know that we can have this as a sink, we can have them as normal functions, we can call methods that have promises in them, and we can set our values depending on whatever happens in those promises, whether they are resolved or rejected. So we'll, once again, change that back to how it was before. And now we need to talk about, what are we to talk about? And now we need to talk about props. So props allow us to pass information from one component to another. So far, we've been working with one file specifically, which is default.vue. But first of all, how would we create another component that we can bring into this particular file? So let's just, in the case of, in this directory, components, create something called article. And then we will turn this file into whatever it is we're displaying here. So we'll explain this shortly, but what we want is a template, and we want to take this let's see, and then we want to get rid of this v4, okay? So what we're trying to do right now is going to be, we want to pass this article in to this component. This component doesn't necessarily need to know how to fetch articles. So we want to pass that information in. So we'll add a script section. Again, we'll export our default object. And then we will say that we want to add props. And the first prop that we want to add is going to be an article. And this is going to be an object. It can either be an object or just a type. And the type is just going to be like the type constructor. So in this case, you could say string. But we'll say we want it to be of type object. And then I think I messed up some of the formatting. Let's see. No, we're good. Okay. So we want it to be of type object, and we have access to other properties within the props. We can say whether they are required or not. So we can say true in this case, or we can say that they have default values. So if you give it a default value, then required is not needed as a property. We're just using this for explanation purposes. So we can say our default is maybe an empty object. But in this case, we'll just say that it is required that you pass in an article to this. So that gets rid of the error here, which means that whoever uses this article component will need to provide us with an article. But we don't have access to this get article details function. So we can also add that as a property, as a prop. And we'll just copy that here and make that an object. And the type this time is going to be function, and we'll just say that it is also required. So now, how do we use this component inside our default.vue? How do we get rid of this? So how we can do that is, first we come here, import the component. So we'll say import article, and then just say, Copilot is suggesting this. What the at means in this particular case, it is a mapping that maps to our source directory. So it's just saying, go into the source directory, check components, and then get the article.vue file. In this case, we're in the same directory, so we'll just say dot slash and then article.vue. So we've imported our component, but if we try to use it now, so let's just say we have it here, article, we'll get an error, which is failed to resolve component article. And the reason we get that error is because when we're using the options API, we need to register that we're going to use this article. And how we do that is typically going to be through this new option, which is called components. And this is simply going to be an object that contains all the components that your component is going to rely on. So in this case, we're using article, right? And we need a comma there. Cannot read properties of undefined title. Wait. Okay. And let's see. Article is reserved in HTML. So again, this error shows us one thing, which is that generally you want your components to be multi-word components, and that's so that we never clash with JavaScript. So in this case, we'll just say this is going to be my article, for example. And we will come here and say we want to call this my article, and then we will simply import that there. So here it says that it has been registered, and the registering is this, adding it to this object called components, but it has not been used. Up here, we have said article, we'll replace that with my article. So right now, let us refresh. Okay, so we'll see cannot read property of undefined reading title. And if we go into our my article component, it's because this article that we're supposed to pass in as a prop is currently undefined. And as we discussed before, we have vbind for binding dynamic values. So what we want to do right now is going to be to take whatever we had here, which is the v4 as well as the key, and loop through our article instead. So we will delete this. So now we're looping through it, but we can't display it because we have not yet passed the article. So how you pass a prop into a component is going to be by binding to the prop. So in this case, we expect an article, and we're going to say that's going to be article. And then we also additionally expect get article details. And in this particular case, we get an error that tells us that get article details is not a function. If we were using something like TypeScript, we would get an error in our, like when we are coding. So we'd get this before we get to runtime. But in this particular case, we get the error in runtime. So that means that we need to pass in our get article details. So again, we'll do another vbind. So we'll just say get article details and pass the get article details. And now it works the same way. So if we refresh this, we have no errors. And if we search now, it still works the same way, except now we've moved this we've moved the details and the implementation details of each article from this file into the my article file. And that means that we can reuse this my article in different places. Alternatively, we could have taken this whole segment that that renders the whole list of articles or says that something doesn't exist, and we could have passed that in, we could have created a component that has that. So we could have made all of this one component, which would have meant we are able to take this and reuse it in other sections, as long as we pass the right information into it. One additional thing about props that we need to mention is that you can either write the props as they are here, which is how we've specified them here, which is in camel case. So you could either do this, or you could use the kebab case. So you could say get dash article dash details, and that would still resolve to the same thing. So if we refresh this, we see that we don't have any errors, and it still works the same way. So that's it for props. Props allow us to communicate with children, which is going to be like child components. So if a parent, which is default.vue, wants to communicate with a child, which is my article, then it can pass information to the child through props. But the question is, what if my article wanted to communicate with default.vue? To do that, you would need to use something called events, and you would need to emit them. Once again, details of this can be found in the Vue documentation. This is slightly more advanced and is not part of the Vue 101, but it is worth mentioning that if you wanted to communicate from parent to child, you use props, but if you want to communicate from child to parent using the options API and the composition API, which we'll cover later, then you can use events and you can emit events. So that's it for that. We'll get back to the next module. So thank you very much and see you then. So one thing worth mentioning is that inside your code, in this case, I've checked out 101-2, there are no drastic changes between what we've been doing so far and this. The starting point is the same, but if you wanted to check for solutions, for example, then you can find them here under your components and then solutions, and you'll find the solutions to the exercise as well as the demo, which is default.vue. The next thing we are going to talk about is going to be the composition API. And as we mentioned earlier on in the training, the composition API is something new that was added in Vue 3, and it simply allows us to write our components in a different way. So far what we've been doing is using the options API. Now, the composition API is going to allow us to write applications that are structured a little differently from how we've been working with the options API. And we will go over the difference between the composition API and the options API, the setup function, as well as this new syntax called the script setup. And we'll also talk about composables. So composables are going to be reusable pieces of functionality. Anyway, so composition API versus the options API. So on the left-hand side, we have the options API, which is what we've been doing so far. So you export a default object. It contains various options that define the behavior in your component. And on the right-hand side, we have the composition API using the script setup syntax. So the script on this options API does not have any attributes tied to it at the moment, and the script on the composition API does. In particular, it just has the word setup. And if you look at this, it looks different from how we do things here. So first, we don't export any default objects, and we define props a bit differently. Instead of having data, we can use refs. So ref simply means that this is a reactive value. And when you're using the composition API, values are not reactive by default. Also, since you're not exporting this default object, you don't necessarily have access to these things being things like data. You don't have access to that by default, so you have to import ref. And in this case, we're just saying that the message is going to be a ref, which is the same as adding a message here on the left-hand side. And it's just going to have a default value of hello world. Then in this particular case, lifecycle methods would be called as part of the options. But here we have to import them from Vue, same as the ref. We have to import that from Vue, and then we call the method here. Now, whatever we've seen here is syntactic sugar for something, which is the setup method, which is what the composition API introduces. So the setup method or function is something that you can use with the old syntax. So if we went back to the previous slide, we can see that in the options API, we exported the default object. So since Vue is an incremental framework, if you were using Vue 2, you can have your Vue 2 application working for the most part and introduce the composition API as needed. And how you do this is you will still export a default object, but you have an additional option, which is going to be a setup function. And this function has props. It passes multiple things to you. So you have access to your props here and a bunch of other things which you can find in the Vue documentation. So inside this setup function, that's where you can use the composition API. Again, we talked about ref. Ref is going to be a reactive value, which is something we will be notified about when it changes. So by default, we'll just say this is hello world, and then our lifecycle method, which is unmounted. And then if we want to access anything from here, we'll need to specify it as part of the return value of this setup method. So the thing is, as your application gets bigger, it might get a little tiresome and annoying to return every single thing that you want to use in the UI, which is why we have the script setup syntax. So it's syntactic sugar that allows us to write less code. And the script setup is used by simply having a script tag and then adding setup as an attribute. And what it allows us to do is, instead of returning values, we can use everything that is here is the equivalent of running it inside this setup. And the thing about that is that you can, instead of returning stuff, everything used in this script setup syntax will be available to your template. So the next thing we need to talk about when it comes to the composition API is going to be composition functions or composables. That's what they're called. And what composables are is simply pieces of functionality that you want to reuse in different parts of your application. So let's say you had authentication, again, borrowing from a previous example, and you wanted to create login functionality that could be called anywhere. So you have your login component, but you also have maybe logout functionality that you want to be able to access in any component. In Vue 2, you do this through mixins by abstracting out the logic required for logout and authentication. But in Vue 3, you can use composition functions, and we'll get into the details of how that is different from mixins when we get to the demo. Speaking of the demo, it is time for us to get back to the code, and we'll go back to the code, and now we will see in our files, I have checked out the 101-3 branch, and our file structure has changed quite a bit, specifically in this components section. So previously we were using a relatively simple file structure so that we could follow along easily. And right now what we've done is we've simply added a bunch of other things that give us extra functionality, such as we fake login functionality. We also have some kind of dashboard or template or layout that we can use. And that's basically what all this is. If you go through all of these files, you will find that they are all Vue files using the same things that we have talked about so far. So in this particular case, we want to go to our default .vue file, which we can find under, which we can find under 3.sections and then dashboard and then default.vue. And then the solutions we talked about before, you can find them here. And if you wanted exercises, then you can find them under views. So exercise 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth, and you can find the solutions for those here. That being said, we'll open our default.vue and we'll look at this, which is using our options API, and we will try and convert this to use the composition API. So the first thing we'll do is copy this, go into composition. We already have it here. So this is literally a duplicate of the normal default view. And what we want to do is, again, change this to the composition API. And how we do that, in this particular case, what we want to do is use the script setup syntax so that we don't have to return every single thing. So we'll just say setup and everything breaks immediately. But we will talk about how that works. For now, we don't necessarily need to care about this Pinia and stores. We'll talk about that when we get to the Pinia module. That is simply a way to have global state management. Oh, and if you want to see your application on the right-hand side now, since we are using additional dependencies like Pinia, you can do npm install. That will install any new dependencies that we have. And then you can do npm run dev. And that will restart our application. Okay, so same functionality as before, except now we just have a random article here, which is just for demo purposes. So now, how do we convert this? So the first thing we need to talk about is the data or data. So how we do this is we talked about refs and them being reactive values. So we'll create a ref, we'll call it filter, and then we will say that this is going to be a ref and it's going to be an empty string for now. And let's see, 1 second, composition. Okay, we don't have that set up. Actually, for the sake of this demo, we will convert the default.vue file so that we can keep track of the changes without having to touch the router, which is another module. So we'll just come to this default.vue file. You can do this in the default composition file, but for us to see our changes here, let's just do it in the default.vue file. So again, let's just undo the changes here, close that, and let's just change this in the default.vue. So default.vue will now break again. And what we want to do is take this data. We want to say we have the filter and we have the articles. Create them as refs. So we'll say filter is going to be a ref that is an empty string. That's the same as this data section. Then we'll say articles is a ref that is an empty array. And then we can delete this. Then since we're using the script setup syntax, any component that you import here will automatically be registered. So we can also get rid of this and the name part. So the name will default to the name of the file. The name of the component, to be clear, will default to the name of the file. But now we're getting an error that ref is not defined, so we need to import that from Vue. So we'll say import ref from Vue, and that fixes the errors here. Then in this default exported object, what we want to do is first handle the computed properties, then handle the methods, and then have this created. So what we'll do is we'll say for computed, how you do it in the composition API is you create whatever it is that you want to be your computed property. So you'll come here and say filtered articles, for example. And then we will say this is equal to computed, and computed accepts a function. We can have this as an arrow function because we do not need to have access to this keyword anymore, as we will see shortly. And then we will come here and say cut this and put it there. Right now we see that everything is broken on the right hand side because we are exporting a default object, which the script setup syntax doesn't allow us to do. But we will fix that once we are done with this. So the next thing we need to do is import computed from Vue. And now everything that was saying this dot something, we need to change that. So if you're working with a ref, you will remove the this dot and you will say the ref name and then dot value. So the reason we can't just access articles directly is because articles is going to be wrapped by this ref, which is going to make it reactive, which means that we can observe the changes that occur to it. So we'll change this dot filter to filter dot value. Let's see. Actually, what we want to do is we'll remove that const filter and we will come here and say filter.value because now we have access to the filter itself. So filter.value, and then we'll just, or we can say const filter lowercase, and we can just say filter.value to lowercase, and then we'll check if our content includes the filter in lowercase, and same thing there. So now we have our filtered articles. And the key thing we've changed is that when referencing things that are refs, we use the name of the ref and then dot value to access the actual value. While in the case of the options API, we would do this dot articles. Now we do articles dot value. And then the next thing that we want to do is we'll delete that. We'll get this random article, cut it, and convert it into our composition API. So we'll just say this is going to be equal to a computed call, and then we'll take the actual function, create an arrow function, and paste that in there. So now we can delete this entire computed section. And it's still broken because we're exporting a default object, but we are going to fix that as soon as we have these 3 remaining items fixed. So now we have our random article that's still using this dot articles. Since we are in the script setup syntax and since we are using refs in the composition API, we'll say articles.value. Then we don't have this function yet, get article random article ID, so we will ignore that until we move it, until we convert it. And I'll just have some water. And then how we're going to convert this is we'll simply make them normal functions because the methods are just functions. So we'll just come here and say either function or const function is going to be that. You can either have it as an arrow function or just use the function built-in JavaScript keyword. So that's going to be easier. So we'll just take this, paste that there, and now we have the get article details available within this scope. Then we'll do the same thing and come here, get random article ID. So we'll define this as a function, and then that means we can now delete our methods. So now in our export default, we are left only with created. And if you look at the error on the right-hand side, you will see that it tells us that it cannot contain ES module exports, which again is this default exported object. So what we want to do is now what we want to do is change this created to use the composition API. But the question is, how do we do that? So you can import lifecycle methods through Vue. In this case, we'll just say before mount. I believe that's what it's called. And we'll just say before mounted. And just do this dot articles. We'll just cut that. Instead of using created, we'll just use before mounted. And in order for us to be able to use await here, we'll have to make this async. And then instead of this dot articles, what we want to do is articles dot value. And now our error will disappear. But we still don't have the random, we can't get the random article ID because we're still trying to say this dot random article ID. So we'll just remove the this dot. And here we will say, instead of this dot articles, we'll say articles dot value. And if we now refresh, should theoretically be fine unless there's something I did wrong. So we're getting an error that says before mounted. What we actually want is before mount, not before mounted. So wait, on before mount. My bad. So the key difference between how you do things in the options API and the composition API is, as far as lifecycle hooks are concerned, or methods are concerned, you don't need to import anything in the options API, but in the composition API, you will import the lifecycle method and it will be on and then name of the lifecycle method. So instead of before mounted, it will be on before mount. Instead of mounted, it will be on mount, and you can import that from Vue. So now if we refresh, this should work, and cannot read properties of undefined reading articles, default.vue 68. Let's see what went wrong. Again, we are trying to access this through this dot and we cannot, so we need to do articles.value. And now we can see our articles. If we refresh, we have no errors in the console. If we search again, now it works. So we've just converted our options API component into a composition API component. And what it involved was removing the default export. We changed up our data with ref. And then, so we're using ref now because that's how you explicitly say that this is going to be a reactive value. Then we took out our methods and just declared them as functions. And then after that, we declared our computed properties, and that uses computed, which like ref, we import from the Vue dependency. And then for our lifecycle method, we imported on before mount from Vue. And in the options API, it would have been called before mount because it was an option. But right now it's on and then the name of the event. So that's the composition API. The one other thing we would need to talk about is composables and composition functions. So in Vue 2, we had the concept of mixins. And what mixins would allow you to do is, let's say we had this get article details functionality that we wanted to be shared across different components. We will be able to come here and create a mixin. So let's just say shared mixin. And then this would be like a JavaScript or TypeScript file. And all this would do, it was simply going to export a default the same way your component would. It's the equivalent of your script section, except it doesn't have a name because it's not a component, but you'd be able to declare your methods, and you'd be able to come here and add this get article and get random. Let me see if I can demonstrate this real quick. So you'd be able to do this. And the reason we're not going into detail is because this is no longer the preferred way of working with things. But basically, if you imported this mixin into your default.vue, it would append these functions into your component, and you'd be able to use this anywhere in any component. The problem with that is that you might have name clashes. So if we had get article details elsewhere, you would never be sure if you're getting the get article details from the mixin or if you're getting the get article details from another place. So maybe inside this component. So what Vue 3 introduced with the composition API is the concept of composables, and we will simply just create another file here, and we'll just say use, and composables typically will have the word use before them and then whatever you're using them for. So in this particular case, we'll just say use article. So whatever domain they apply to. So if we say use article here, we will split our screen. And okay, that's not doing what it's supposed to. Let's just say we have that, and then we close that. So this is our mixin. Actually, I'll do it the other way around. So this is our mixin. I don't think I did anything there. Anyway, this is our mixin, and how we'd implement this functionality in composition functions is we would again export something, but this time it would be a function, and it doesn't have to be the default export. So we can say export const, let's say use article, and then it's going to be a function, and this function is going to return an object. Now, whatever is returned as part of this function is going to be the functionality that we can use from this composable. Let me demonstrate what that means. So in this case, we had the get article details. We'll close out our mixin shortly, but you can copy these functions, declare them inside this composable, which again is an arrow function. And then we want to say that anyone who uses this use article can access this functionality. So we'd add a comma here, and we'd come to our default.vue file. We can now delete this. And additionally, we could, let's see, we could also take this, the filtered articles, as well as the articles. We could actually take both of them. In fact, let's do this. We will take all of these things and move them into our composable. So right now we're getting errors because there's a bunch of stuff that isn't imported. So we'll just add the missing imports. On VS Code, if you're using a Mac, you'll press Control period, and you can trigger whatever actions are relevant. In this particular case, we're not getting the IntelliSense that allows us to import things automatically, so we'll just do it manually. We'll import ref and computed, and we'll import them from Vue. So that fixes these are the errors. The errors we're getting right now are because we have not used these things yet. So we just want to export everything that we want to be able to use. And in this case, I'll just paste those here, add commas, and one more comma. And now that means anywhere else in our application, we can use all this functionality without having to rewrite it. So how do we do that? Right now, we have broken our entire application, and it says we cannot read properties of undefined, articles is not defined, but we actually want to do this through, let's see. So we want to import this from our use article composable. And how we do that is come here and say import, let's just say use article from, and then use article.js. So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to import it. And then the second thing we need to do is say that we have various fields inside this use article. So we want to destructure them, and we will say use article, and then we'll come back to our file. Everything that we exported here is accessible to us. So we'll just copy that and paste that. And now all our errors have disappeared. So, all. Let's see. Cannot read properties of undefined, default.view 54. Let's see. Default.view, articles.value 54. Okay, so get articles. Let's see. Articles. Just one sec. And we'll try and fix this. Let's see. So get random article IDs and needed. Let's first get rid of the things that are not needed, so it's easier for us to see what the problem is. I'll zoom out. And on before mounted. Let's see. Console log. It's probably not the best way to debug, but anyway. Articles.value and refresh. Actually, so the main issue here is we've created a new file, but our, our application does not know that we have created a new file yet. So we need to undo that. We need to stop running our application. Then we need to run it again. And okay, that did not fix it. Let's see. Default of Vue 47. Articles. Cannot read property articles. Let's see. One sec. Right. Okay. So instead of destructuring, here's what we can try. We can eliminate that and say this is going to be our article composable. And then we can try and article composable.article. I missed TypeScript. Anyway, let's see. Articles is not defined. 49. Yeah. And then here we can see article composable. Okay, so silly me, what we were doing before was correct, but the reason it doesn't work is because we forgot to call use article. And now if we refresh, it should work. And if we search, this works the same way. And yeah. So what we've done now is we've taken all the functionality that was here, we've moved it into this file called use article, which is a composition function or a composable. Composables usually by convention start their name with use and then the name of the domain you're operating in. So in this case, use article. And then we've moved all the functionality here. So you import it, then you call it, and then you can destructure it and access the values in any file. So that means now if we wanted to use any of this functionality, we can use it in any file without having to duplicate the actual functionality. So that's it for composables and the composition API, and see you in the next one. So as part of the composition API, let's look at the difference between these two. So the mixin is going to export default objects, and that's going to have methods, computed, data, while the composables or composition functions will actually export a function that returns an object. And this avoids name clashes because every single time you use the composition function, you end up creating a new instance of it. Therefore, it is difficult for you to have name clashes. Anyway, that being said, the exercise for this chapter is going to be module. The exercise for this module is going to be to convert whatever you had done in the second exercise or in the exercise that needed you to create your joke application, convert whatever you had written into the composition API. That's going to be it. In case of anything, again, feel free to check the solutions. The exercise is going to be found in components, 2, views, and then the name of the exercise, which is exercise 3. So convert this into using the composition API. Welcome to the next module, which is going to be the Vue Router. Now, the Vue Router is the official router for Vue.js, and it deeply integrates with the Vue.js core, which allows us to build single-page applications easily, and it allows us to add routing to our applications. The router has a couple of features, some of which are listed here, and we are going to see these more when we get into the demo section. So we have nested routes, we have the ability to import components dynamically, we have a modular router approach. Again, we're going to see all this in the demo section. Speaking of the demo, it's time to actually demo this, and this is going to be relatively quick. So going back into our project, we will need to check out the 101-4 branch in order to follow along. So you just run git checkout 101-4. We'll zoom back out. And now we need to talk about a few folders and files that we did not talk about earlier. And that's what I meant when I say we'd get to understand what these folders and files are as we go over the different modules. So the 2 things we'll need to care about, the 3 things we'll need to care about in this particular case are going to be this router directory. So if you open this, we have an index.js. Again, if you feel stuck, feel free to pause. And if you feel really stuck, feel free to check out the solution here. So our index.js is going to be our router file. And this is where we'll be entering all the routes. Right now it's empty. So if we were to do npm run dev, and we went to this page, it will be empty. So in previous modules, what we did have was routes that had been pre-configured for us, so that's why we could see what was happening. But we did not talk about it because we were waiting for this module to talk about the Vue Router. And then the other thing we need to care about is going to be the app and main.js. But first, we'll start with our router. So in our router, what we want to do is import two things from Vue Router. So we want to import create router, which will allow us to create our router, as the name implies. And then we want to create web history and we want to import those from Vue Router. The next thing we need to do is actually create our router, and our router is what will be handling our different routes. So right now we want our demo to be displayed here. So our demo is the same thing we had in the previous module, and how we create a route is going to be through const route, and then we'll just say create router, and this is a function that accepts an object which accepts various properties. So the first thing we need to specify is the history, and we'll just call create web history. And what this is it determines how we navigate through our page. So in a typical SPA, which is a single page application, we would, instead of using create web history, what we'd use is create hash history. And that would mean that if we were navigating here, we would say something like this. So if you wanted to, let's say, go to a contact page, you would say /hash and then contact. And what this would do is it would give you that fluid SPA-like feeling, and it would not write anything to the history of your browser. So it would feel very much like an app. So if you wanted to do that, we would instead import create hash history, web hash history. But since we don't want to do that, we actually want to be able to preserve the history of our application. So if we go to /contact, we should be able to see, we should be able to go back in our browser's history. And I don't know why I'm using air quotes. We should be able to go back to our browser's history, and using create web history allows us to do that. So that's the first property that we need to provide. The second thing we need to provide is going to be our routes, and these are the equivalent of our pages and where we can navigate to. And this is going to accept an array of all the routes that we do have. So this is going to be an object. Each route is going to be an object, and this object can contain multiple properties. So one of the properties that routes can contain is going to be path, and path is simply on which page will we land on this route. So right now, what we want is to land on the default page, and I'll just copy the URL. So in order to import a component and have it act as your route, so if you go back to the home page, still empty. If we want our home page to be displayed, which is the default.vue file, then we need to use component. And what component is it's a property of this route, and any route can have a component that is going to be used to import it. So the next question would be, why are we using an arrow function to import this? So this is called a dynamic import. So if we were to remove this arrow function, it would still import the component. However, the problem is going to be that this will wait until the component is loaded in order to show us whatever our page is. And we don't want that. So we want to allow it to defer the loading of the component until the component is actually ready. And to do that, we need this arrow function, which will basically make this a dynamic import. Some other properties that the routes can have, which we discussed when we were talking about the features of the Vue Router, are children. So children is going to, again, accept an array of routes, and each route can be nested in here. So if you had a layout, we would, for example, add the layout here, and then we would add the children here, which would be the things that are nested inside it. So picture this: if you had a page, if you had a page that was to be displayed to authenticated users only, maybe you'd have a route, you'd have a layout file that you want to use to display things in a specific structure. Maybe you have a navbar, a footer, and like a logout button. So you would do this in your router by specifying the component, the parent component, to be your layout, and then under children, you would then come here and specify that you want default.view, which is your child component, to appear within this layout. Now, as for layouts, we will go to components and then layouts, and we'll check out some of the layouts that have been pre-created for us. We will shortly understand how we can display things inside them. And how we do this is not through this slot, it's through something called router-view. And speaking of slot, since we haven't talked about it before, slot is going to allow you, when importing a component into another one, as we did before, this is going to be a place where you can enter any content into whatever component you are working with. So for example, if we had another component and we had, I'll get rid of this router view just for the sake of explanation. So if we had, let's say, my component, and this was the usage of this authenticated, or I'm going to say authenticated, can't type, authenticated, then whatever you write in here, so whatever you write in here would be added to this slot section. So this slot would be replaced with whatever this content is. There are more interesting things that you can do with slots, and you can find more information about this in the Vue documentation. So anyway, back to the router view. So if we wanted to display, let's say we wanted in our router to display the default.view inside this layout.view, how we would do that is, instead of slot here, we would say router-view. And what this allows us to do is to specify that whenever there is a child to a route, so if this authenticated is our layout file, whenever there's a child to our route, then we expect that this default.view would be under it. So the only reason why we haven't gone over this as an actual example on the right hand side is because we still need to talk about a bunch of other stuff and how the router is connected to everything. So back in our router, again, here we would have the router-view if we wanted to nest routes. So back in our router, we have these properties. What we are going to do now is talk about how you would modify this path. So let's say you wanted, if you went to slash, you wanted this to be the default.view nested under the layout, then you can leave the path as an empty string. But let's say you wanted this to take you to a specific article, you would add, for example, another route. So we'd say path, and then how you can add params is by using colon and then article ID. So this is going to be the name of your param. And then you can add the components the same way. So we can say, maybe we wanted to go to article details, for example. So article details, if we had such a page. And then what this means is that anytime now we go into this and then add anything, we'd be able to access that as this article ID. However, we can instead say article/article ID, and that would take us to a specific article. So in this case, we'd have the article, say, dad. And yeah, that's pretty much it as far as the structure of the router is concerned. We will get into a more practical example shortly after we discuss how you connect all this. So the next thing you need to do is export a default router. And this is going to be whatever router we've created here. And then we are going to open our app.vue. And inside our app.vue, we can see that we have a router view, which is what we talked about before, which means that anything that is specified in the routes would actually end up being displayed here. So the app.vue is going to be the entry point of our application, and everything is added to this. So if we check our elements, we can see div id equals app. If we change this to Apple, then refresh. Wait a minute. Inside this, we can see Apple. So now the question is, how does Vue know that these routes this is the router that should be used? To do that, we need to get to the entry point of our application, which is the main.js file. And in this case, what we need to do is, this file has already been pre-populated, by the way, but what we need to do is first import create app from Vue. By default, when you create a Vue project, this will be generated for you. Then it will import the app.vue, which is this file. And then we need to register a router, and that router is what will determine what appears in this router.vue. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is, to keep this example simple, we will get rid of all of this, children, and we will come and import our default.vue file here. And the moment we do that, we see our view. No pun intended again. So in our main.js, what do we need to do to make this work? So in our router, we exported a default router, and our router is created using create router. And this default router is what we import here in our main.js, which again is the entry point of our application. And we create our app, then we say that our app is going to use this router. And that's how it knows. So if we get rid of this line, for example, we will now see that our page disappears because our application does not know where our routes reside. So now it's time for an exercise. Based on what we have talked about so far, I will challenge you to create 3 more routes for each of the exercises. So we should be able to go to /exercise, if I can type, exercise. And then if we say exercise 1, we should go to exercise 1. If we say exercise 2, we should go to exercise 2. You have the option of doing this using either this approach of creating all of them as individual routes, but I would challenge you to create them as children. So you create a route that represents exercises in general, and then you map children to them. So as we talked about earlier, as we had discussed earlier. So that's going to be the exercise for the Vue router. And once again, the Vue router simply allows us to add routes to our application, and it allows us to do that dynamically and through components. So you can have components inside of components inside of components, and the way you'd nest them is through children. So that's it for this module. If you need some time, feel free to pause, and if you feel stuck, once again, you can check out the solution. So good luck, and see you in the next one, where we'll be talking about Pinia and global state management. In this module, we'll be talking about Pinia, which is the Vue.js global state management solution. And Pinia is a store library for Vue. It allows you to share state across your different components and pages. So the question is, why would you even use Pinia over the previous example that we had? So here's why we need state in the first place, before we get to why we need Pinia. So let's say we have our app.vue and we want to pass some information to a child component. As we've seen before in previous modules, you can do this through props. So if a parent wants to speak to its children, it can pass properties down, which are also known as props. Then, if a child wants to pass information to the parent, we can do this by emitting an event, and we briefly talked about this. So picture this situation where you have a header and you have a search inside the header, then you have your app.vue as the parent, then you also have other components such as a container, maybe to contain your articles, and you have some tabs. So the app.vue will have the child of header and main container, then main container will have the tabs and the articles. So what happens if we wanted to now filter our articles, as we've been seeing in the demos? If we wanted to filter our articles from the header and have them filtered in the articles section, what we would have to do is anytime someone searches for something in the search component, we would need to pass that information by emitting an event to the header. The header would need to emit that event to app.vue. Then app.vue would take the results of that event, and this sounds complicated because it is, and there's a better solution, which is Pinia. Anyway, so app.vue would then pass the information that it received from the header to main container, which would pass it to tabs, which would pass it to articles. And this becomes a pain very quickly. So how does Pinia solve this? So what Pinia does is it allows you to have a central store where you can store information, and you can use that information, you can enter information into that store from any component, and you can read it from any component. So in this case, instead of the search having to communicate with the header and then communicate with the app.vue, what we would have is search would communicate with a store, which is this concept in Pinia of something we can use to store information. And then once it has updated the data in the store, then we can read that data from our articles component without having to pass things around through props and events. So that is what Pinia would allow us to do. Now, there are various concepts in Pinia, and we've been talking about the options API throughout this entire training, and there are different things that map to different things in Pinia. So in our components, we can store our data in the data section, but in Pinia, in our store, this is going to be called state. So it allows us to store private data or data, depending on where you're from. Then the second thing is computed. So computed, again, are things at the computed properties are properties that that derive their state from other things in your component. So for example, in this case, we wanted to get filtered articles based on the search criteria. So those are computed properties. In Pinia, they are called getters. And then we have methods in our components, and methods in Pinia are called actions. They can also be asynchronous, and they can be used to make API calls similar to methods. So enough talking, it is now time for the demo, and we will move back into the code. We will check out the 101-5 branch. This is going to be our Pinia branch. First, we will need to discard these changes from the previous module or save them. Then we would check out 101-5. And here you can see that our router is a bit more complicated than it was in the previous example. We used a simple example, but everything you see here is things we've learned about, except maybe the before enter, which is something called a navigation guide. And this is something that you can find in the Vue documentation, Vue Router documentation. Anyway, speaking of Pinia, what we can do is we are now going to talk about this folder, which we haven't used so far. It's called stores. And we've discussed what a store is. This is where we'll be storing our Pinia stores. So we currently have 3 stores. We have exercise 5, which will be your task for This, which is going to involve you creating your own store. We have the use article store, and we have the use user store. So the use user store has been set already as an example, but the use article store is what we want to actually work with. So before we do that, let us first run our application. Oh, actually, we need to implement the store first, which is interesting. So how do we implement a store? The first thing we need to do is import, define store from Pinia. Then with our defined store, we are going to create a new store. We will say, in this particular case, we want to export it and say we have, we'll name it in a similar manner to naming composables, because you can use them in similar ways. So we'll say use article store, and this is going to equal a call to this function, which is define store. And we can pass in, as a first argument, we can pass in what the name of our store is. In this case, we can just call it article store. And the second thing is going to be an object. This object is going to contain the various things we talked about. So state, which is equivalent to data. So we'll just say state. And similar to data, this is going to be a function that returns an object. So in this case, we'll just use an arrow function and say we have articles, and we'll make that an empty array for now. Then the next thing we want to do is, so let's say we've done that, we want to open our demo file, which is default.vue, and we want to get the functionality that is here, we want to move into our store. So now if we try to restart our, if we try to restart our application, npm run dev, it should hopefully work. Awesome. And this is just a bunch of functionality that was added later on, but it uses the same principles that we've been talking about. You can find this in your module 101-5. So we'll just say my name, Allan Jeremy, and then we'll say login. And right now we can see all our articles. So how do we move this data? So right now, if we wanted to move this search into maybe the header, we'd need to do what we saw in the example, which was have it communicate with the header, then the header communicate with the application communicates with the articles, this articles section, and that would be a nightmare. So we want to move all the functionality that is involved here into our store. And this is going to be similar to what we did with composables. So we've defined our state here. We need to add our getters. These are going to be our computed properties. And then we need to add our actions. So what we're going to do is we will now split the screen. And if you're on a Mac, that's going to be command and the pipe operator. If you're on a Windows, that's control and the pipe. So now we want this data to come into the store. So we'll just take that. And again, we're going to delete this. And then we want all of these computed properties to come into getters. And we don't need to change anything so far. Then we also want our methods to come into actions. So we've cut all that. And now we don't see any articles here. So the question is, how do we then use our store? So we can import our store. Import cannot type. So we can import our store from the stores, and then let's just say use article store.js. And what we want from this store is going to be this use article store, which we export. So use article store. Then we will then we will switch to using the composition API. So we'll delete all this. We'll delete the export default and just cut this part, which is where we are getting our articles from. So we can delete that, add a script setup here, and remember that any component that is imported here will end up being accessible here without having to register it. It registers itself. So the next thing we want to do is return the functionality. So we'll just say on before mount from Vue, and we will just return this functionality. So we've done this conversion before when we were discussing the composition API. So in this case, we'll just say our articles .value is await get articles, and that would mean we need to have an async here. However, this is not how we are going to access our articles if we're using a store. We would have accessed our articles this way if we were using a ref. So if we say articles equals ref and then articles, but now we want to use our store. So we'll say const article store is going to be equal to a call to this article store. Now, how do we access the properties that are inside this? How we can do that is by accessing them as properties on the article store itself. So we have articles here. So let's say articles is going to article store.articles is going to be await get articles. And then since we are working with filtered articles here from the use article store, we will come to where we are looping through them, and instead of filtered articles, we'll just say article store dot filtered articles, and once again here article store dot filtered articles, because we're now getting it from the store. So on before mount, not on before. And we'll have our console here in case we have any errors. Okay, and then the next thing we need to bind to is going to be our filters. So we have our filter, we'll just say article store dot filter, and we can refresh this. We'll get context dot get article details is not a function, which means we are accessing it from wherever we were accessing it before. So since it's in the store now, we'll just say article store dot get article details, and now we get the articles. So we have just moved all the state management from this file into our store, and again our store is defined using define store. We can go back to using one page, or one file, and define store will accept the name of a store, which you can see in the dev tools when you install those. Those are not part of the Vue 101. And then you have your state, which maps to whatever you had in your data section in the options API. Getters map to whatever you had in the computed properties. And again, if we search here on the right hand side, we will still be able to do the same stuff. The only difference is that now the logic that is used to store the state is global because we are using Pinia. Again, one more thing that we should know about with Pinia is you don't always have to modify the state like this. So for example, you don't have to say article store is going to be articles, article store.articles is going to be awaited get articles. Instead, what you can do if you want to modify the actual state is you can call patch, which is a method. We'll just cut this await. So patch is going to be a function that you can use to update any property within your store. So in this case, we want to update the filter. We want to update the articles to be the result of this get articles, which would be like your API request. So you could have this get articles in your store if you wanted, and how you'd access stuff like this is again using this dot. So if you wanted this to use get article details, you would do that through this dot get article details. But anyway, back to this file. So you can update stuff using the patch, and this allows you to update multiple properties at the same time. So if you wanted to update, let's say, the filter to be potato, then if you refresh now, it should have a default of potato, because before we mount it, we have said that we want to update the articles with this list that we get from get articles, and we want to update the filter. So you don't always, again, have to do article.store equals article and then modify it. You can also use this patch. So that's going to be it for the global state management of this particular thing, this particular project. And what we are going to do as an exercise now is going to be exercise 5. The instruction is simple. You take whatever you had in exercise 4 and you create a store. So this exercise 5 is supposed to be a store that stores all of the jokes that are in your application, and that means they should be accessible from any page whatsoever. And you are going to move the logic similar to what we did in our demo file here. You're going to move the logic from within your script to the Pinia store that you end up creating, similar to how we have created this use article store. That's it for Pinia, and next we will be moving to testing. Our final module is going to be on testing. Now, there are different types of tests in software development. We have end-to-end tests, which are tests that test for the functionality of an entire application. So if you had login functionality, this would be the test that makes sure that you load the page correctly, the form is loaded correctly, it has the correct fields, and it does what it's expected to do, which is it logs in a user that has provided the correct information and fails to log in a user that hasn't. Component testing is going to be if we wanted to just test the form and see that it submits the data, for example, that it says it does, and also see that it has specific fields, then that's where we do component testing. We also have unit testing. So unit testing is going to be testing the smallest possible unit in your application. So in the case of login, you could say that if you call the login function, you expect that it calls a certain authentication service. So those would be your unit tests. Then we have different tools that we can use to write our tests. We have things like Cypress. So Cypress is going to be used for end-to-end tests. We have Puppeteer and Playwright. Those are all going to be used for writing end-to-end tests, which again is the flow of your application from beginning to end for specific pieces of functionality, such as authentication. You would do that with any of these tools. For unit tests, you can use these tools. Vue has Vue test utils, which are the recommended way of interacting with things in Vue when it comes to testing. We also have vtest, which allows us to write tests, and this is going to be a unit testing framework. You can also do component tests here. So before we actually get into the code, we need to discuss some of the testing concepts that we have. So we have grouping, which is if we have a set of related tests. So for example, we have authentication functionality or we have login functionality, then we want to be able to group the different tests depending on how they are related. So if we have login functionality, we'd have a group that is called login functionality, for example. And then under that group, we would have different test cases. We would check whether the password, if the password is correct and the email that has been provided is correct, that we are logged in, and if the password or email is incorrect, we are not logged in. So those would be our test cases. Now, when writing code, how we do this is we have a function called describe in vtest and in jest, which is another tool. And describe will take the name of whatever it is that you want to call this group. So in this case, we'd say login functionality. So describe with a string login functionality. And then the second argument it takes is going to be a function. And this function will contain all the test cases that you want within it. Also worth mentioning that you can group groups within groups. We'll see more of this when we start writing tests. And then we also can create test cases. So test cases are the specific things that you're testing for. So if the password is correct and the email is incorrect, we want to make sure that someone cannot log in. So we can create test cases by using either it, which is a function, or test. Test is an alias of it. And the first argument is going to be the description of what you're testing for. And the second argument is going to be a function that you can pass your assertions and test logic into. Again, we'll see this when we get to the demo section. Speaking of assertions simply allow us to confirm that an application is behaving as it should. And the syntax for this is going to be expect and then the assertion. So for example, if we expect 1 + 1 to be 2, we'll say expect and then 1 + 1, and then we'll say dot to be, and then that's a function. We'll see more of that in the demo section. But basically, assertions simply make sure that things are working as they should, and we are asserting that the behavior is expected. Mocking is going to be a piece of functionality that we have in testing that allows us to create fake functions. So sometimes you might have a function that makes a request to an API and we don't actually want to use the API. We want to fake calling an API. When we are running our tests, we do that through mocking. So similar to how our Vue applications have tests, similar to how our Vue applications have a life cycle, testing also has a life cycle. So what happens is before all of our tests run, we will have a before all hook. And then before each test runs, we will have a before each test, as you can see in this figure. And if after each single test, we will have an after each. And after all of our tests are done, we would have our after all. So while testing may be awesome and it may be useful for helping you figure out what problems you have while testing may be useful, or it may help you figure out what issues you have in your software and allow you to catch bugs early on and assert that your application behaves, how it should behave. There are some pitfalls, and some of them, this is very opinionated, but some of them include that 100% test coverage, which is that all of your code has been tested, is sometimes counterproductive. Setting up continuous integration and continuous deployment to automatically test your applications can also be very messy and involve creating databases. And then it's also difficult for us to know how much of testing is too much testing. And now it is time for our demo. So we'll head back into our code editor. We have closed our browser because we will not be using that anymore. And I have checked out the 101-6 branch, which is going to be what we'll be using for this module. We'll go to our files and we will look for tests, which is going to be in our root directory. This time we're not in source. So we'll go to tests and then create.spec.ts. So one thing we need to mention is, how do you name your test files? So if you're using something like vtest, which by the way, you can install by doing npm install vtest. If you're using something like vtest, then you will need to name your files either .spec.ts or .test.ts if you want them to be recognized by vtest. So if you say .test, this will still be recognized. And where this is configured is through this file, vtest.config.ts. And this simply says what we want to include as tests. So in this case, it would only detect the .spec.ts, and .test.ts would actually not be detected. But if we wanted to add that, then we would come here and say, instead of .tsx, we want to say .test.ts. It is a convention to use .spec or .test. So yeah. So we'll rename this back to what it was. So .spec, and then we'll come back here and we'll remove this. So when it comes to our tests, we've discussed the theory of how you create your tests, but the actual practical things that you need to do is, if we are going to be testing something like our Pinia stores, which we will import a bunch of stuff. Sounds intimidating, hopefully won't be. But before that, we need to import the different things that we'll be using. So we want to group our tests. We will import describe, we'll import it, we'll import expect. And then we'll just get all of these from vtest. Now we want to start describing our first test, and we will just type describe, and as we discussed, the first argument is going to be the name, so we'll just call this create.vue. What this is testing for in the browser is whether we can create a new article, which is a piece of functionality that was added, the details of which we did not go into because of time, but it is exactly the same stuff that we have been talking about the whole time. So the second argument is going to be a function, and this function is going to contain our tests. So for now, we just want to say that the form loads correctly. So we'll just say describe, can't type, describe loading a form. And we want to test that we'll open the create file here. So that's Command P if you're on a Mac, Control P to open a file using this quick menu instead of looking for it in the browser here or the Explorer. So just open create.vue. So we can see what we are actually testing. So we're testing that we have the form here. Also note that we have IDs for the different sections of the form, and we'll be using these IDs to select and assert that these things exist in the DOM. So the first thing we want to assert in this loading a form is that we have our title, which is, if we were creating an article, this would be the title of the article. So it should, and we can write this how it would sound in English. So it should contain an input for entering the title, for example. And then what we're going to do is we need something that can allow us to select things in our component tree or in our DOM. And in order to do that, we will need to import something from Vue test utils. And in this particular case, that's going to be, let's see, import mount from Vue test utils. I cannot type. So what mount is going to allow us to do is simply mount our application to the DOM in our testing environment. And how we're going to do this is we want, before every single test, we want this component to have been loaded. So we will get our before all, and IntelliSense is suggesting that we import it from vtest. Then this is a lifecycle method. We'll have an arrow function inside this, and inside this before all arrow function is where we want to mount our components, which is this create.vue. So we'll need to import the create.vue, and this is going to be the imports. And right now we have an error because we have not yet used it. So this before all, we actually want to have it within loading a form, because in this particular case, we're just trying to group things according to what functionality they represent. So we will say that we have some expected values. These will be used to check whether values are changing correctly. We'll see what that's like later being in a few minutes. And then we have our wrapper. So our wrapper is going to represent the thing that has this component. So it's going to represent like a DOM tree. And how we will set this is going to be wrapper is going to be mount, and then we will mount our create component. So mount accepts multiple arguments. If we do this, we've mounted our component, but remember we were using Pinia as of the last module. So we also need to set up Pinia for our testing. So we want to do that on for all of the tests, and we'll do that like so. We'll say testing Pinia. So since we can't access our live store through this, we will need to create an instance of our Pinia store that we can use for testing. So that's what this is going to be. And then before each test, what we want to do is set our testing Pinia to something. So behind the scenes, when you define a store, it will create a Pinia instance for you, and it will map that Pinia instance to your Pinia store when you're using the application. But in this case, we don't want to call create Pinia as Copilot is suggesting, we want to do create testing Pinia. And we have an error because we need to import this. And where we import this from is from import create testing Pinia from Pinia/testing. So Pinia/testing, this at Pinia/testing is another dependency that we would have to involve to import or rather install. So we do npm install at Pinia/testing. If you are on this branch and you want to follow along with the tests, you'll just need to do npm install. In the package.json, we've already added the dependencies that you'll need for this. And just to mention them, the dependencies are vtest, Vue test utils, and at Pinia/testing. So now that we've installed them, we can come here and set our testing Pinia to be an instance of, to be a call to this function, which is create testing Pinia. And this accepts an object that contains multiple options regarding how we want to set up this Pinia store. So first, we will use this create spy property. And this is used to create something that we can use to allow us to observe the behavior of our store. So for example, if a value changed, let's say you are building an authentication or a login system, if the value of an input changed and that affected the value in the store, we would want to know that that happened. And in order to do that, we need to create something called a spy. So think of a spy as something that allows us to go into the details of something and gathers information about that thing. So in this particular case, the information being gathered is going to be the things that are happening within the store. So this function was called, the spy will tell us about it. So we want to say create spy, which is this property is going to be vi.fn. And vi is going to be imported from vtest. Vi is going to be imported from vtest, and this is going to be a property of this vi, which is a vtest test util. And all we're going to do is just say that create spy is going to be v.fn. So what that means is it will just create a function that acts as a spy. So it will send out a spy that can gather information for us. Then we also want to say stub actions is going to be true. And what this means is create a fake version of the actions. So if an action was calling an API, for example, we don't want it to call an API. We don't necessarily in this test care that it called an API. We care that the function was called. And in order for us to avoid the complication of having to mock every single function in a store, we need to stub the actions, which just means that we will have fake versions. They don't necessarily do every single thing that the action would do, but we do get to observe whether they are being called or not. So that's what we're going to do in our before each. Again, we're getting an error because we haven't imported this. So before each, and once again, this is a lifecycle method. So we've set up our testing Pinia, but we now need to connect our testing Pinia to our component that has been mounted. And we're going to do that through the second argument of this mount, which allows us to provide various options. It happens to have an option that's called plugins. This accepts an array, and it's an array of whatever plugins are needed for this particular mounted component. So in this case, we want to say that we want for this create component, for this create component that has been mounted here, we want to use this store, which is testing Pinia, which we created earlier. Now, that's most of the setup that we need. We can now get into our actual test cases. So the first test case that we want to test for, and we can run our tests shortly after this, is that we have a title. So we'll just say const title. We want to find out if we have a title input. So we'll just say input, title input, and then wrapper dot find, and this is going to accept a CSS selector. So you can say input slash title, input pound title, and this will just say we are looking for an input that has an ID of title, and we happen to have an input that has an ID of title here. And then we expect that our title input should exist dot exists. So this function wrapper.find returns a wrapped DOM element, and this has a function called exists, which simply tells us whether this thing exists or not. And we can just say we expect that this should be true. So in your expect, you have this right hand side, which is called a matcher, and to be is one of the matches. There are many others, so you can check if the value is something specific. You can check if a function has been called. You can check if a function has been called multiple times. A whole list of this can be found in the vtest documentation, but in this case we just want to assert that we expect this to be true. So if things are correct here and all is well, we should be able to come to our console or terminal, and we can go into our package.json and check how we can run our tests. We can use test:unit, and this has already been set up for you, but the details of how you set this up can be found on the vtest documentation. So we'll come here and say npm run test unit, and this will run this particular test. So one moment. So unit failed to load this component. So this means our URL is a bit broken. I think we need that. And now it passes all of our tests. So you're seeing 4 tests passed because we have a bunch of tests in the solutions, which again, if you're stuck, you can use this solution. But if we specifically wanted to run this create.spec.ts file, then we would open our vtest config, and instead of checking for everything, which is this asterisk, which is a wildcard, we can just say create.spec.ts. And then now, if all is well, let's see, we will have only one test passed, which is this test. So now we want to add a bunch of other tests, and we will also check that the form is loaded with an empty title. And how we can do that is we don't have to set this expected values, but for the sake of this, we will just do this so that we can show you how you can reuse different pieces of functionality or different values in your different tests. So in this particular case, we will say that our expected values is going to be an object, and this object will contain a title and content, which is going to be an empty string. So what we're saying here is that we expect when this thing is loaded, when this create component is loaded, that the title will be an empty string and the content will be an empty string. And we can write that test here. So it should load the title input with an empty string. Or it should have an empty title. And again, this can be whatever test it is that you want to implement. So in this case, we already know that this is how we can find the title input. So we'll copy that. And the question is, how would we check for the value? So we can say first, we can say the text is going to be title value. We will take our title input, which is what we have here, and then we will say that we want to get the text in that title input because it is a text input if we open our create.vue again. Then what we want to check here, this is our assertion. We want to check that the title value is going to be our expected values dot title. And then we can copy this test and adjust it to test. Oh, actually, before we copy, we can check here. We can see that 2 tests pass. If we said, let me show you what it would look like if we failed. So let's say we expected the title value to be empty, an empty string, but or we expected it to be this as a string. So expected values, or we expected it to be hello. Then we would get this as a failure message. So we'd get that we expected hello, but we received an empty string, which we actually do want it to be an empty string. So we're just gonna do this. Alternatively, you could hard code this here. The only reason we haven't done that is so that we can demonstrate how you'd be able to reuse this in multiple tests. So without further ado, we'll copy this and we'll say that it should have empty content. And then we want to get a text area this time. So we'll get the text area with our find. And there's a bunch of things that you can use within Vue test utils. You can check out the documentation for all the different things that you can call on this wrapper, this DOM wrapper. Anyway, we want to select the text area that has an ID of content. So, and we want to rename this to content text area, for example. But instead of doing that, we could just say content here and just chain this dot text to the end. Then now we want to assert that our content is going to be the same as whatever our expected value is. So again, if we said hello here and maybe said this is what no, actually that won't help. Anyway, so we say, if we said we expect hello there, then it would fail. Cannot call text on an empty DOM wrapper. Right. So the reason we're getting this error right now is, wait a minute, let's see. Title input cannot call on an empty DOM wrapper. Let's see. Let's just undo what we've done so far. And right. So I accidentally copied too much, which is a risk that you might have, and then modified the wrong thing. But so it should load, it should have empty content. We'll just erase this altogether and write it. So we'll just say const content, and then we'll say it's our wrapper, and we want to find a text area that has an ID of content. Then inside this text area, we want to find the text, so we don't have to create 2 variables as we did here. I just simply did this for the sake of explaining that you can chain stuff to this DOM wrapper that is returned when you call this find. And if the element cannot be found, then we would get this error that we cannot call this on an empty DOM wrapper. But in this case, we happen to know that we can indeed find our text area with an ID of content, as we saw here. And we want to assert that this content is going to be of our expected value. So if we said hello here, this would fail and say that it expects a string. But if we instead put an empty string here, then it will pass, because our content by default, if we check this vmodel article.content, the content is a string. If we change this to foo, for example, and then let's see, and then npm run test unit, this should fail. It doesn't fail for some reason. So if we so here's the thing. We've mounted this with these default values in our test. So we expect that by default the content is going to be an empty string. So here we'll just change it to expected values.content, and that will pass. Now the next thing we want to test for is going to be adding an article, and we will need to use the article store in this particular case. Remember, we did stub actions and we set up our testing Pinia. So anyway, this means that our tests will now be using this as the default Pinia store. So we'll import our use article store from here, and I'm just copying for the sake of time. And we will now add another group. So we'll collapse that and say describe. One moment. So we want to test for adding an article. And the second argument is going to be an arrow function. Inside this arrow function, inside this group, what we want is to define our store. So we'll just have something that is scoped within here called article store. And then before each test, before each test, what we want to do is, article store, we simply want to say use article store. And then when you have a store and there is no registered Pinia instance, then you need to pass that as the argument to the use article store. So in this case, we need to pass in what Pinia instance will be used. If we try to save this right now, we'll get an error, and we can just say something. Let's see, can we demonstrate this real quick? Expect true to be true. That should obviously pass. But if we were to try and access something from this store, so if we said console.log article store.articles, then we will get an that means cut. Anyway, then we will get an error anytime we actually try to access things from this store. So we'll pass in our testing Pinia here, and I just realized that trying to demonstrate how we would get an error would take more time. So we'll just go over the fact that when you create a store, the function expects either to receive a Pinia store as the first argument, or if the application has registered the Pinia store, it will use that one. So in the case of our UI, we didn't need to pass in any Pinia store because we had registered our Pinia store in our main.js file. That being said, we now want to add the test cases. So we should check that it triggers the creation of an article whenever the create article button is clicked. So we're gonna get the wrapper. So we'll get the wrapper, which once again, we'll delete what Copilot is helping us with for the sake of explanation. So we'll create a wrapper. You can create it inside each test, or you can create it inside the before all if it's going to be shared by the tests. So in this case, every single test was relying on the same wrapper. But in this case, we have the test being the only thing that's relying on the wrapper, so we can create the wrapper inside the specific test. So once we have our wrapper, we want to set the value of our title, and we want to set the value of our content. So our title could be maybe the article title. So we can say wrapper.get, and we can use this hash to say that we're looking for a specific thing. As we've discussed before, this is CSS selectors. So in this case, we'll just say input title, and then how we set a value. And this is it. So the difference between find and get is that get will assume that this thing has already been mounted in the DOM, and if it is not immediately found, then we will we'll get an error. But find waits until the thing is mounted before using it. So more details on this can be found in the vtest documentation, not the vtest, the Vue test utils documentation. But anyway, in this case, we're using get. You can use it interchangeably with find, but preferably we'd use find. Right now we're just using get because we wanted to talk about the fact that it exists. This also returns a DOM wrapper, and here what we want to access is set value, which simply allows us to set the value of the input. And in this case, we can say hello, or we can add the same functionality that we did have before. So we had our expected values, and we can just add our expected values here as an object, and just say we expect that our title is going to be test title and our content is going to be test content, for example. So this is the content of our article, the title of our article. So we want to set the value of this input, which is our title, to expected values.title. And here we'll see how we can reuse this functionality once again within our test. And since we only have this one test, we don't need to have our expected values here. We can remove that from there, cut this, and put it here. So const expected values is going to be test title and test content. So now we've set the value of the title. We want to first assert that the title itself, okay? We want to assert that the value of this title has indeed changed. So if we were to get this title again, and you can abstract that away into a variable, it'll still work the same way. So if we say it's const text input is going to be wrapper get input title, and then here we say set value, and we now check if our text input value has changed. So if we say foo, we expect it to be test title. So if we say that we expect it to be foo, this should be here. And we can now run our test. And oh, this is the incorrect assertion, so we need to do the text and call that. And we're saying we expect foo, but we received an empty string, which means we did not get to change our value. What we do want to check for, though, in this particular case, in this particular test, is going to be that when we click on our button here, that the information, that the form is submitted, or at least that the add article is called. And add article is in our use article store. So we have this function. This was added later on. So how do we assert that that has happened? We can use v.spy on, and again we mentioned that spies allow you to check if specific things have happened in our store. So in this case we want to spy on our article store, and specifically we want to spy on the add article function. So if it moves or if it does anything, we want to know about it. So we'll get rid of that assertion for now, and we will abstract this. We'll remove this abstraction, and then we'll do the same thing, but for the content, text area and content. Then after we have changed this, after we have entered those values, we will spy on the add article, which means that we'll know if it has been called. Then we will get our button, which is going to be wrapper.get, and then we'll just say button, and we only have one button in this case, so we don't need to provide it with an ID. And our wrapper is going to be our create.view component. So we will call this trigger function, which again is part of the Vue test utils and part of the DOM wrapper. Again, more details on that in the Vue test utils documentation. So we will trigger an event. This is going to be a string that represents whatever event we want to trigger. And in this case, it's going to be a click. This simulates clicking on this button. And that means that this submit should be called if we search for it. And submit should call this add article. And we want to know that it has indeed called the add article action in our store. So we can start that by checking that article store article add article has been called. So we'll say to have been called. Once again, you can find the different matches that are available to you in the vtest documentation. So right now we just want to assert that this has been called, but your tests can be as simple or as complicated as you want. And this is why we talked about how much is too much testing. Anyway, for the sake of this demonstration, this is what we want to test. If we now stop the test and run it again, npm run test unit, this should pass. But let's say you wanted to maybe assert the opposite behavior. You can chain not to this matcher. So you can say not. So expect whatever your assertion is, and then dot not, and then the other matcher. So in this particular case, our test will fail because we expect add article to have been called. So it will have been called. So it says, okay, we received one call to this. Oops, 1 second. I'll say so we'll say text area hash content is going to be the content, And right now our test is failing. It's telling us that, oh, our spy told us that they received a call to add article with an object that contained the article that we're adding, which is test content, as well as test title, which again are the values that we provided here. So if we change this to foo, we'll see that that's foo here. And then if we wanted to maybe assert that it has been called with something specific, you can use to have been called with. And again, this chaining not works for everything. So it works for all the matches. So we'll remove that for now to have the correct assertion, which is going to be our add article should have been called, which is what happens. And now our tests pass. So that's going to be it for the testing. The exercise for this particular module is you should add a new test under tests and unit, and we will revert this to what it was before. So add a new test to this called joke.spec.ts. You can call it whatever you want as long as it's .spec.ts, or add whatever extension it is you want to use here. And then in that file, we need to test for whether or not you can create a joke. And this, again, this functionality for a joke is going to be from your previous exercises if you have been following along. And for the most part, that's going to be your test. Just test that you can create jokes, that jokes are displayed correctly, and that a punchline or whatever functionality you think your exercise application has, and you need to assert that behavior, you should consider testing it. So that's going to be the challenge. Thank you very much for attending this Vue 101 training. It has been great having you. My name is Allan Jeremy, and do have yourself a good day, a good night, whatever time of day it is, or whatever time of night it is, and goodbye.
This program is presented by This.Labs, a framework-agnostic consulting firm helping enterprises realize their technical goals through staff augmentation, consulting, project management, on-demand subject experts, training, and other professional services. Find out more at This.Labs.com.